Welcome to part 2 of Mesoamerican cultures. Today we will be talking about the Aztec civilization. The Aztecs are going to be located in what is now present-day central Mexico, and they're really going to flourish in post-classical period 1300 to 1520 CE. They're really known for dominating a large part of Mesoamerica from the 14th century to the 16th century. The Aztecs were a marginal tribe prior to the 15th century. They had their capital in what is now present-day Mexico City on the edge of Lake Texcoco, which I'll show you a great picture of that coming up. They're going to have a highly organized government ruled by an all-powerful emperor, and they're going to use a tribute system to rule over conquered peoples, which we'll also talk about coming up later as well. They're going to conquer a lot of different cultures. One of the other interesting things you see is that once they conquer a different place, they distribute that conquered land to their own people based on merit. So sometimes it would be soldiers, for example, that maybe they did something really well in that particular battle, and then they would get land from it. The Aztec people are a little unconventional in the way that they structure their government. So they're non-traditional because they're going to allow conquered people to maintain some of their independence. They will sometimes set up like kind of dummy figureheads in these places from people in their own city. So they still kind of feel like they have power. The only thing is they have to pay tribute to the Aztec government and the Aztec king. Gender roles in the Aztec Empire are also interesting to look at. So women in the Aztec civilization, they could own their own property. They often had a lot of legal rights, and they were able to work in roles outside of their homes. They were able to hold jobs like merchants. They could even be priests or midwives, things in the medical field. And their roles were really recognized as very vital to keeping the civilization going. So while it is a patriarchal society, women did have a little bit of free movement. There is a pretty clear social divide in the Aztec Empire between the nobles and the common people. So status is hereditary, just like most major empires we've studied. But you can obtain privileges through basically skill in warfare. So for example, if a warrior takes a captive, they earn the right to use certain weapons and specific like clothes and dress because of that. So that's kind of a status symbol that can be earned. Another interesting thing that kind of sets the Aztec apart from other peoples we've studied is that slavery is not necessarily hereditary to the Aztec Empire. So basically, for an example could be if you had to sell yourself into slavery to pay off debts, your children would not have to be slaves because you were a slave. So there are some unique circumstances that slavery is not hereditary in the Aztec Empire. The capital of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, is set on Lake Texcoco, and it has a population of around 100,000 people by 1473, making it one of the largest centers, like urban centers, in Mesoamerica's history. And it's even estimated that before the Europeans came and really wiped out the Aztecs through disease, that it may have even reached up to more than 200,000 people. In the city center, you can see the Great Temple, one of the greatest examples of Aztec architecture that we have today. And this is where most of the human sacrifices of the Aztecs are so famous for were carried out. You can also see that the city is interlaced with canals, which make it easier for the Aztec people to trade more goods because they don't have any load-bearing animals. Remember, they don't have any horses or oxen or anything that can carry large amounts of goods. The Aztecs have a very intricate economic system. They do have evidence of a currency used. A lot of times this currency was the cacao bean, so what they used to make chocolate with. So small purchases, for instance, one small rabbit would equal about 30 cacao beans. Larger purchases, they would usually use this very particular cotton cloth that was very hard to make, and that's what you would use to buy larger things. So like most civilizations, their trade products are going to be distributed through marketplaces. But what's interesting is in the Aztec Empire, most marketplaces were specialized. So for example, vendors' goods were usually themed something. One interesting example of this is that the Aztecs had a specific market just for dogs. So you would go there specifically to buy a dog. So you'll see different markets pop up all over these Aztec cities. The Aztecs are also going to participate in a lot of long-distance trade. They have specific merchants for this that are more like higher class individuals, and they're called Pochtecas. and they're going to bring back mostly luxury items from other parts of Mesoamerica. The last point worth noting about the Aztec economy is that land was not something the Aztecs considered to be a commodity, meaning that it could be sold between noble people, but that practice wasn't very common. So they didn't really think that land was something that you traded or sold constantly. So it mostly just stayed in specific families, these noble families, for generations on end. The Aztecs are also well known for using a calendar kind of similar to the Mayans. The original calendar they had was actually made up of 18 months, which consisted of 20 days in each month. And each 20-day period was named after a specific religious festival. But they're going to end up switching over to the Mayan calendar because they found that to be a little bit more efficient later on. They also are going to develop the concept of a leap year to help keep them on track seasonally. The Aztecs don't have a fully developed writing system quite like the Mayans. They're going to have a mix of symbols and phonetic letters that they're going to use to communicate. So they may have, for example, like a picture of a mountain and then some sort of like phonetic script at the end to symbolize a word rather than just one or the other. As for what they wrote on, the Aztecs did not use paper. They didn't know how to make that. They actually are going to use animal skin, mostly deer hides, to create any kind of book that they're making. They're known for having these really elaborately painted books that told stories about their, specifically mostly about their religious life. The Aztecs are also well known for their songs and poetry. They regularly held festivals that would include things like dramatic presentations, so kind of like plays. They had musicians present, and they also had acrobats. So they were really engaged in art and culture. And these religious festivals, they fell at the end of every month time period. So basically every 20 days, they all had a different festival going on. The Aztecs are going to be polytheistic and it also include elements of animism. And central to their practice is the concept of sacrificing to deities. So basically, the gods are only going to favor you if you give them something that's important to you in return. So one of their most famous gods is Quetzalcoatl, and he is considered to be one of the highest gods, and he's the god of intelligence. So this kind of shows the importance that intelligence and culture had on their society, which is interesting because basically once Western civilizations get a hold of the Aztecs' narrative of history, they really paint them as kind of this savage, brutish people. But it's funny, they have a central patron god, kind of like Athens did, the god of wisdom and intelligence that they really focused on. They're also going to have a lot of nature spirits as their main deity. And having nature deities is actually really common in most polytheistic civilizations. So they're going to believe in things like a rain and storm deity, for example. Actually, the rain and storm god has his own room at the Great Temple at Tenochtitlan. It has a whole room dedicated just to him to just show you kind of the importance of that. And really the reason that happens is that people across the world are trying to explain why things happen the way they do. Why do you have these monumental floods? Is it because you did something wrong? It's kind of hard to just imagine that nature has a mind of its own and there's not a spiritual reason for why this thing happened to you. So you see in most polytheistic cultures, they do worship like sun gods or rain gods, and people make sacrifices to them to try and control the world around them. So this will wrap up our talk about the Aztecs. As we know, the downfall of the Aztecs comes from an introduction to Europeans, basically, the guns, germs, and steel. And we'll talk more about that in a different lesson. So thanks for listening.